This series will be on the Duchy of Courland and Semigallia, a story you've probably never heard about, and if you have, you've most likely heard very little. This video will be on the events that preceded the founding of this duchy, and the reign of the duchy's first duke. First, let's set the scene. Russia under Ivan the Terrible had created an impressive military and had expanded quite a bit. His eyes were soon set on Livonia for multiple reasons. The Teutonic Order had recently become a vassal duchy of Poland, the Duchy of Prussia. Not all remnants of the Teutonic Order were lost, though. The semi-autonomous branch in Livonia, known as the Livonian Order, was still there, but it was decaying. Not only was it a part of the endlessly confusing and changing Livonian Confederation, but it was also falling prey to religious division, since the Protestant Reformation had reached Livonia. Although the Holy Roman Empire had supported their German brethren in Livonia for quite a long time, a shift in priorities and general apathy stopped the aid from coming in. Now with the stage set, the play can begin. The year was 1556. The current master of the Livonian Order, Heinrich von Galen, was preparing for war. The Archbishop of Riga, Wilhelm von Brandenburg, chose Christopher of Mecklenburg as his coadjutor the year before without even consulting the Livonian Order. This, as well as the fact that he was the brother of Albrecht, the first Duke of Prussia, and the cousin of the Polish king and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Sigismund II, had led most of the order to believe that Wilhelm, Albrecht, and Sigismund were planning on taking the order's territory. Galen decided to prepare for war so that he didn't get caught off guard, and so that maybe he could make a preemptive strike. He sent out the commander of Dunaburg to the Holy Roman Empire so that he could hire some mercenaries. This commander's name was Gotthard Kettler. On his journey to the Holy Roman Empire, Gotthard would see the huge and fearsome comet, in shape not unlike a broom, and it was as though it pointed a finger at the disaster which was subsequently to befall Livonia. The suspicions and paranoia in the Livonian Order got worse and worse, and as this fear was boiling over, possible letters from the Archbishop of Riga to Prussia were intercepted and decoded. These letters supposedly showed proof of a conspiracy, and that was it. In preparation to what was coming, there was an election for Galen's coadjutor. Jasper von Münster represented the Protestants, while Wilhelm von Fürstenberg represented the Catholics. Fürstenberg won the election. Galen ordered Werner Schall von Bell to bring some men and wait near Kokenhausen, where Wilhelm von Brandenburg and Christopher resided at the time. Werner's goal was to intercept any message to or from the Archbishop. A delegate from Sigismund tried to sneak their way to Kokenhausen, but he was caught by Werner's men. He was beaten by them so badly that he died a few days later. Soon after, every bishopric in Livonia and the Livonian Order declared war on the Archbishop. The most important target was Kokenhausen. Fürstenberg arrived on June 28th, and only 2 days later, both Brandenburg and Christopher gave themselves up. What followed was diplomatic chaos. Delegates and letters were sent from every player on the Baltic, and it took Sigismund marching a giant army into Livonia for an agreement to be made. In 1557, everybody met under Sigismund's tent in Pozval. The Archbishop and his coadjutor would be allowed to resume their positions. An alliance was made, though it didn't actually do much in terms of promised action from Sigismund, though it made Ivan pretty nervous. Speaking of Ivan, the Livonian Order was also not allowed to renew its truce with Russia. I should probably let you know that Galen is no longer the master of the order since he retired and died a few weeks later, so currently Fürstenberg is the master of the Livonian Order. Russia had responded to the new agreements made between Sigismund and the Livonian Order by sending raiders across into Dorpat. It's unlikely that Ivan was ready to invade, but after hearing about Livonia's pathetically weak response, he realized that the conquest of Livonia wouldn't be as difficult as he first assumed. And so he prepared for a proper invasion. Gotthard finally came back to Livonia and came to the city of Narva. He camped near the city, but not in the city itself. A few days after setting up camp, Narva lit up. The fire was so big that Gotthard and his forces 20 miles away could see it. Gotthard and his men rode to Narva as soon as they saw it. The city was huge and they weren't familiar with the layout. They spent some time looking for a guide, but they couldn't find one, and since Gotthard didn't want to risk being ambushed, he just went back to camp. A few hours later, some refugees from the city arrived. Narva had fallen, and Gotthard couldn't do a thing. The funny thing is that the Russians probably didn't set the fire. It was probably just a house fire that went out of control, and the Russians took advantage of the situation. Now the Russians had a stronghold across the Narva River, giving them a good point to continue their invasion. Not only that, but they had access to the city's leftover artillery and weaponry, and access to Western merchants who were very willing to trade with the Russians. The next target Russia had was the city of Dorpat, a city that was also very close to the Russian border. After a short siege, everyone in the city knew that things were hopeless. Not only were they suffering from Russian artillery, but also Russian sympathizers setting fires and working with Ivan, who had come to the siege of Dorpat personally. The city was eventually taken. The Livonian Order swiftly lost control of the situation. There was barely any organization, everyone blamed everyone for the predicament they were in, and most of the commanders were doing terribly. Not Kettler, though. Kettler had proven himself to be one of the only competent commanders by taking the castle of Ringen. Soon after this victory, Russia made a 6-month truce with the Livonians so that they could deal with Crimeans. And unexpectedly, Kettler was absolutely livid. You see, he had just hired a bunch of mercenaries in preparation for an assault, and since the order lacked soldiers, he couldn't just let them go back or stop paying them because if the Russians attacked, they were needed. So what happens when a bunch of mercenaries are spread across a region that's actively falling apart and are paid to do nothing? Bad things. Bad things happen. Although the truce did give Gotthard, who pretty much became the de facto master of the Livonian Order, the time he needed to work on diplomacy. A delegation went to Sweden, and a delegation including Gotthard went to Lithuania. The trip to Sweden went well at first, but then there was a hiccup. One of the men in the delegation, when addressing the King Gustav, said, "His most illustrious majesty," instead of "His most sincere majesty." Negotiations went nowhere. The delegation apparently got to see some reindeer though, so it's not all bad. I'm not kidding about that, by the way. So how did the other delegation fare? Well, actually pretty well. In Vilnius, a defensive alliance treaty was signed, basically saying that Sigismund could get some castles in exchange for money, that he would give military aid against Russia, and that once peace is made under certain conditions, the Livonian Order would have those castles back, in exchange for the money that they gave. This agreement was sent to the HRE, whose emperor promised to finally aid Livonia once more. Once Gotthard came back, he became the de jure master of the order, while Fürstenberg was sent to defend the central city of Fellin. Even with this new defensive alliance, the problems that the order was having didn't just go away. Many soldiers and mercenaries just stopped following orders since they weren't receiving enough pay anymore. The countryside was ravaged by Russian raiders and unpaid mercenaries making up for their lack of pay, while the economic aid they were expecting from the Holy Roman Empire was nowhere to be found. Also, they were running out of horses, and in a 16th century war, that's very bad. Kettler tried to take a fort near Narva, but a few days in, most of the peasants and mercenaries just straight up left, most of them not even waiting to get their pay, and so he was forced to turn back. The city of Fellin fell to the Russians after mercenaries had given up the old master Fürstenberg, who would be imprisoned in Russia never to be seen again. Then the King of Denmark's brother bought 2 bishoprics and planned on taking Livonia for himself under Russia, and Raval pledged allegiance to Sweden because they were sick of having to deal with Kettler's lack of anything and footing the bill for a lot of the war. It's easy to see why Kettler thought that submission to a greater power was the only way for the order to survive in any sort of capacity. The existence of Prussia showed Kettler that he could probably get a vassal duchy if he opted for submission to Sigismund II. So he did. Negotiations in Vilnius in 1561 would lead to a treaty that includes this. We will bestow upon the illustrious Lord Master of Livonia the ducal title, like that of the illustrious Lord Duke in Prussia, together with all dignity, insignia, and ducal privileges. Most of Livonia would become part of Lithuania. The former bishopric of Courland would be given to Lithuania a few years later, and the city of Riga a few years after that. The Livonian Order's territory left of the Daugava River became the Duchy of Courland and Semigallia. The Pacta Subiectionis, also known as the Provisio Ducalis, and a little later the Privilegium Sigismundi, were pretty much the constitution of the new duchy. It included the freedom to practice Lutheranism, the continuation of the nobles' privileges they had before the establishment of the duchy, and the right of Germans to hold official posts. The documents also established that the Duke of this duchy is equal to the Duke of Prussia in status, and that the title is hereditary and can only be given to males. Now starts the reign of the first Duke of the Duchy of Courland and I'm just gonna say Courland. I don't care if it's technically incorrect. The correct term is a mouthful. Where was I? Alright, first Duke. Gotthard stopped getting involved in the war directly, though he did give military and material aid to Poland and Lithuania for their efforts in the war. Just because Gotthard stopped getting involved in the war doesn't mean he could just lie back and relax. Seeing as he became the ruler of a newly created vassal duchy, he had to gain the support of his nobles. Many already accepted him, since this situation was better than being part of a polity that was actively falling apart, but not everyone accepted him. The best example of that would be Matthias von der Rieck. Matthias refused to accept Gotthard for a reason I couldn't find, so take your pick. Matthias was the commander of Dublin, and after Courland was created he gave himself the title of Lord and Heir to Dublin. Gotthard tried to negotiate with him, but he wouldn't budge. Although Gotthard wasn't done with him yet, he had other things to tend to. One of the reasons that many nobles didn't like Gotthard was that he wasn't part of a royal family. He was just a noble statesman that became the duke because he was in charge at the right time. To make it harder for nobles to make that argument, he married a princess, Anna of Mecklenburg, in 1566. Anyway, now that he had his royaltiness boosted, it was time to take care of Matthias. A few months after he got married, Gotthard captured Matthias as he was beginning his journey to the Holy Roman Empire. He took away most of Matthias's land in exchange for his release, but this wasn't the end. Matthias would go to Lithuania and argue in the courts for the rights to his lands back. This issue would go on until 1576. In 1569, Poland and Lithuania officially united. I mentioned this because Courland was no longer a vassal duchy of Lithuania, but a vassal duchy of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1570, Gotthard created the Privilegium Gotthardinum, a new constitution which had a lot more rules. Throughout his reign, Gotthard also showed his commitment to Lutheranism. He had dozens of churches built or restored, had all the important Lutheran books translated to Latvian so that the native peasants, many of whom were actually still pagan, could read up on God and stuff. Look, religion isn't my strong suit, okay? Also, Gotthard's wife, whom I'll just call Duchess Anna, helped Gotthard a lot. As a princess, she was pretty familiar with estate management and other noble European duties. She even received envoys and local nobles for informal meetings about official business. Although all this may sound fine and dandy, this all had to do with nobility. The nobles didn't really care about the local Proto-Latvians. They made up most of the laborers, but the nobles had no incentive to actually help those people out. Many of them became serfs because they were either refugees that didn't have any other option, or they were locals that were under the control of the nobles that had lost much of their wealth during the war. Courts could also condemn free people to become serfs, and there was no way to appeal for that. Most of them were not allowed to leave their land, hunt, brew alcohol, or even sell their surpluses. I say most because the rules on taxation and regulation on non-noble activity varied depending on where you lived and which lord you served under. For an example of good treatment, the Kettler family is perfect. Gotthard would actually treat the peasants that lived on their lands much better than most of the other nobles. Peasants were allowed to have military and clerical careers, and taxation was never raised out of nowhere for no reason. This might not sound like much to us today, but for the 16th century this is pretty good. The coat of arms of the duchy was finally accepted by the new king of Poland-Lithuania, Stephen Batory, in 1579. It took a long time because of the Livonian War and the almost civil war that preceded Batory's ascension. The lion represents Courland, the elk symbolizes Semigallia, the shield in the center has a pot hook that comes from the Kettler coat of arms, and the SA stands for Sigismund II Augustus. Gotthard and Anna had 3 children that would live to adulthood: Anna, Wilhelm, and Friedrich. And that's mostly it. By 1580, Gotthard Kettler was over 60 years old. Thankfully, Gotthard had the Duke's court and a diet that was represented by the nobles, so the duchy didn't fall into chaos as he became more senile, but he also couldn't just retire. His children were still young after all, none of them could take the mantle yet. Sadly, death doesn't wait for when it's most convenient to strike. In 1582, the Livonian War finally ended, and in 1587, Gotthard Kettler shut his eyes for the final time. Gotthard Kettler's body was put in the Mittau Palace vault, the vault that would also house the corpses of his successors. I'm pretty sure you can visit that vault nowadays. I'll leave a link for that in the description. Will Gotthard's successors be able to turn this fledgling little duchy into anything more than it was? Well, we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? Gotthard Kettler was dead. Now comes one of the greatest tests to a leader's legacy, their heir, or in this instance, heirs. Gotthard's chosen heirs were his two sons Friedrich and Wilhelm. The obvious problem, though, was that Friedrich was 17 and Wilhelm was 13. As you can imagine, there were plenty of instructions for how the boys would inherit the duchy in the case that they were still minors, which they very much were. First of all, the administrative duties of the office would be split territorially into Courland under Wilhelm and Semigallia under Friedrich. Anna, Gotthard's widow, would have authority over the city of Jelgava, a very important city in the duchy. Gotthard's daughters, Anna, and the one I forgot to mention last time, Elizabeth, weren't given much. They were both married off to different nobles and didn't have much say in the duchy's business. Since Wilhelm was still a preteen, Friedrich would run Courland as well as Semigallia until Wilhelm came of age. Friedrich was also assisted by the Duke's court and 10 counselors picked by Gotthard, since, although he wasn't as young as Wilhelm, he was still a teenager. All of that seems to have worked out pretty well. The only noteworthy thing to mention before Wilhelm takes charge of Courland were the regulations on celebration and dress. Regulations authored by Anna, which were meant for Jelgava but ended up being applied to the whole duchy. These regulations weren't necessarily unique, but they're still very interesting, so I want to have a look at them. There is a lot, but here are some highlights. Weddings could only take place on Mondays. Betrothal was permitted in a church, in the courtyard of a church, or in the home of honest people, in the presence of witnesses. No town dweller could wear a dress made of velvet or satin, and much, much more. Wilhelm was transferred authority over Courland in 1595. This didn't shake up anything, and the duchy continued to run smoothly. Wilhelm invested heavily in Courland's industries, especially shipbuilding and Ventspils, while Friedrich ran his side without doing anything especially noteworthy until he married Elizabeth Magdalena. Like her husband's mother, Elizabeth was very involved in estate management and diplomacy as well. Not all would stay peaceful though, for there was tension between the great powers that surrounded the duchy. The reason why is a little complicated, so stick with me here. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania was an elected position. Although being related to a previous king wasn't a requirement, it definitely upped your chances. The former king and Grand Duke Sigismund II did not have any descendants. His sister, however, did. Catherine had married John III, the brother of the King of Sweden, Eric XIV. It wasn't the 14th Eric, but that's a story for another time. John eventually became king himself and had a son with Catherine, who was also named Sigismund. After the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Stephen Bathory, passed away, Sigismund was elected to take the throne, becoming Sigismund III. In 1592, Sigismund also became the King of Sweden after his father died. This unity could have created one of, if not the most powerful entity in Europe, but it didn't last, because of religion. Sigismund was raised as a devout Catholic by his mother, but the Swedish weren't big fans of the Pope, so they resisted. Eventually, Karl, John III's brother and Sigismund III's uncle, who was serving as Sigismund's regent while he was in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, took the throne in 1599, becoming Karl IX. Not the ninth Karl, but at this point, not surprising. Most of the Polish and Lithuanian nobles didn't really care about Sigismund's claim to the Swedish throne, but Sigismund claimed Swedish Estonia, an action that most of the aforementioned nobles were cool with. Sigismund had literally no authority over Estonia, but after Sigismund tried to integrate Estonia in the Commonwealth, the Swedish decided to fight back. The war started in 1600. Friedrich and Wilhelm would be involved almost immediately, since the fighting was usually fairly close to Courland and Semigallia's border. Though both of them tried to get both sides to recognize the duchy's neutrality, the duchy's status as a vassal of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth pretty much forced them to fight on the Polish-Lithuanian side. In 1602, Anna passed away and Friedrich took over Jelgava. With the brothers' attempts at getting their neutrality recognized failing horribly, they both had to fight against the Swedish. sometimes even in person. The most famous instance of this is at the Battle of Kircholm. The opposing forces met in the city of Kircholm, a city on the other side of the river that made the duchy's border. Friedrich led 3 cavalry units across the river to join up with the mostly Lithuanian force that was still outnumbered by the Swedes, even after Friedrich joined. Despite that, the Lithuanians were victorious, causing the Swedes to retreat. Matthias von der Rieck, not the one from the last video, but his son, I think, one of his descendants for sure, almost captured Karl IX, but Karl made it out safely. Matthias got his helmet and sword though, which are some pretty awesome souvenirs. The war was far from over, but winning that battle allowed the duchy to have some breathing room for the next few years. In 1609, Wilhelm married Sophie, the daughter of the Prussian Duke. This marriage was very strategic. Not only did it make the 2 duchies closer, but Courland gained a city that was leased to the Prussians during the Livonian War. Sadly, this marriage was to end in tragedy. Just over a year later, less than 4 weeks after her son was born, Sophie passed away. This tragedy greatly affected Wilhelm. Even if the marriage was strategic, from the letters that have been preserved, it would seem that they were pretty fond of each other. Wilhelm would never again marry. In 1611, Karl died, and his 17-year-old son took the throne. This boy's name was Gustav II Adolf. The Gustav Adolf, as in the man known as the father of modern warfare by some. Oh boy. The war took a toll on the duchy. Disease and starvation became commonplace. This probably caused a lot of stress for the brothers, especially Wilhelm, who had just lost his wife. And eventually, Wilhelm snapped. To explain why, I'll have to go back in time. After Gotthard's death, the Commonwealth found an opportunity to integrate the duchy into the Commonwealth proper. Courland and Semigallia had 2 different diets, and the Commonwealth was able to get most of the nobles in those diets to help them. In Courland, the conspiracy was especially treacherous, according to Wilhelm at least. In 1615, Wilhelm straight up disbanded the diet and started executing nobles he thought were committing treason. The nobles didn't take this sitting down, of course. They sent a delegate to Sigismund III asking him to do something about this, and he was more than happy to. A few decades prior, a law was passed that basically said that once the Kettler family had no more male heirs, then the Commonwealth would annex the duchy. One of the dukes had no children, and the one who did just did something that could justify deposing him. Sigismund set up a commission to investigate the situation. Wilhelm refused to submit to the investigation and refused to show up to trial. The commission recommended that Wilhelm be deposed and banished, and so in 1616, he was. In 1617, Friedrich was allowed to take control of the entire duchy. Friedrich was also pressured to accept another constitution, the Formula Regiminis. This constitution changed a lot, but basically it gave more power to the nobles at the expense of the duke. The war with Sweden also came back to the duchy's border, but this time, Gustav was able to capture Jelgava in 1621. The next year, Jelgava came back into Friedrich's hands, but was lost only 2 years later. Actually, a lot of the duchy's land was taken in 1625. But thankfully, after years of sending delegations to the opposing sides, Friedrich got a deal that would allow for both sides to recognize the duchy's neutrality. Gustav demanded that the Swedish army be allowed free movement throughout the duchy and free use of the duchy's ports. He also demanded that the Commonwealth's forces would not be allowed to use the duchy's fortifications or even set up camp within the duchy. This was very unfavorable for Friedrich. Friedrich allowed both armies to use certain roads freely, and allowed free trade with the Swedish in the duchy's ports, but no more than that. After a few years, Sigismund accepted these terms, and so Friedrich no longer had to fight in the war, but the duchy was still a bit of a battleground. It wasn't until 1629, when the Truce of Altmark was signed, that the war finally ended. The duchy's lack of direct action after 1625 allows us to talk about something else. You see, while Friedrich was fighting Gustav militarily, Friedrich was fighting Sigismund politically. Despite the fact that Wilhelm's banishment allowed Friedrich to take control of the entire duchy, Friedrich didn't want the duchy to be annexed as soon as he died. So he spent a lot of his time after Wilhelm got banished trying to get his brother and his nephew back into the line of succession. Frederick was even able to call on allies from other European nations like Denmark, France, and especially England. The English and Scottish King James I supported Wilhelm a lot. In fact, James was Wilhelm's son's godfather. You may be wondering why the English king was so invested. Well, that's because Courland and Semigallia was very friendly to Baltic traders, including British ones, so they were a great source of revenue. But also, the duchy was Protestant. Technically, both states didn't practice the same sect of Protestantism, but their shared "fuck the Pope" attitude was enough for English kings to support the little duchy's continued existence. James sent a delegation to the Commonwealth in 1620, but Sigismund just referred to his commission's previous decision. In 1621, Gustav offered Wilhelm the entire Duchy of Livonia, as long as he accepted Swedish suzerainty. Wilhelm declined. England still wasn't done trying. In 1629, the King of England, now Charles I, sent Sir Thomas Roe, a man with quite the resume, to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to help mediate a peace between the warring states. Sir Thomas Roe was also instructed with reinstating Wilhelm or his son into the Courland and Semigallia line of succession. This went as well as you'd expect. At this point, it was clear that Friedrich was not going to give up until his brother or his nephew's place in the line of succession was restored, and Sigismund was not going to let that happen. Both sides needed the other to die for their goals to be reached. After a few more years of trying, in 1632, Sigismund III died. Sigismund's son, Władysław IV, turned out to be much less invested into the annexation of the Duchy of Courland and Semigallia. Thomas Roe, with the assistance of French diplomats, successfully convinced Władysław and enough of the Commonwealth to accept Wilhelm's son as Friedrich's heir. They couldn't reinstate Wilhelm, but at the very least, the duchy would continue to exist. By 1640, Friedrich was old and tired. He had successfully kept the duchy out of Swedish hands by fighting back enough to get a favorable deal, and he had outlived the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, which finally allowed Friedrich to have a legal heir that would allow the duchy to continue its existence. Friedrich Kettler was 70 years old in 1640. He was around 17 when he first became the duke. He had held his position for an excruciating and turbulent 53 years, and he held it together despite everything that happened during his reign. Personally, I'm against the glorification of anything in history, but that doesn't stop me from respecting Friedrich a great deal. In 1642, at the age of 72, Friedrich passed away. With Friedrich now dead, the ducal title was passed down to his nephew, Jakob Kettler. Unlike his predecessor, Jakob was an adult when he was bestowed this responsibility. Another interesting thing about Jakob is that he had big brain, and that big brain was put to use. Jakob turned a duchy that was still suffering from the effects of a war with Sweden and Sigismund III's meddling, and turned it into an economic powerhouse that could rival even the Dutch. The big question is, how did he do it? Let's start with his life before becoming duke. Jakob Kettler was born in 1610. He was the son of Wilhelm Kettler and Sophie of Prussia. Sophie tragically died just a few weeks after Jakob was born. He was raised by his mother's relatives from the age of 2. Wilhelm was banished from the Duchy of Courland and Semigallia when Jakob was around 6 years old, and this meant that Jakob was no longer in the official line of succession. Jakob proved to be a very smart boy. When he was 13, he was studying at the University of Leipzig. That is until his uncle, and current Duke of Courland and Semigallia, Friedrich Kettler, called his young nephew to the duchy. He was welcomed with a ceremony as Friedrich's unofficial heir since he didn't have Sigismund III's approval. It would take a decade until Sigismund died, and Sigismund's heir finally accepted Jakob as Friedrich's heir. It would take a little less than a decade after that point for Jakob to finally become the duke. So in the meantime, he went around Europe. This trip had 2 purposes. The first was to add legitimacy to him as an heir. He would introduce himself to nobles all over Europe as the heir, and if he gives people a good impression, other nations would support Friedrich's possible heir. The other was to study. He knew multiple languages, including German, Dutch, French, Russian, and even Latvian, which was the commoners' language in the duchy. He went to multiple universities and studied history, philosophy, geography, shipbuilding, and economics. He would also be introduced to a certain economic theory, an economic theory called mercantilism. Mercantilism is a very important economic theory that deserves its own video to fully explore, which there are plenty of on YouTube. But the basic idea was that the goal of a state was to have as much wealth as possible, and that the best way to achieve that was to maximize exports and minimize imports. This theory will drive a lot of Jakob's ambitions. Finally, in 1642, Friedrich passed away, and it was Jakob's turn at the helm. Jakob Kettler understood that the only way for the duchy to have influence and, more importantly, make money, is to use the seas and to take advantage of trade, like the Dutch. He also understood that the duchy was in a perfect position for this. Not only did it have a lot of coast with a nice harbor, but it had locally produced resources that could support a low-cost shipbuilding industry and plenty of cheap labor. So with that, and the help of Dutch artisans, he built one of the largest fleets in Europe in a surprising amount of time. Not only were they facilitating their own trade, but they were able to trade their own ships to other nations. Of course, Jakob didn't only make trade ships. The duchy's natural resources didn't just amount to stuff that could make shipbuilding easier. The duchy also had the resources to make soap, bricks, muskets, cannons, lumber, and plenty of other stuff. Before I move on, I should probably explain how Jakob Kettler could practically do what he wanted when the duchy's nobles gave Jakob's predecessors a hard time. Well, Jakob's position as duke wasn't as an absolute ruler. The Kettler family was designated as the largest landholder, who was also in charge of industry and foreign policy. Also, since Jakob's goal was to make as much money as possible, it's not hard to see why the nobles would align themselves with that. Also, in 1646, Władysław IV, the Polish king and Grand Duke of Lithuania after Sigismund III, gave his authority of customs over the duchy to Jakob Kettler. This meant that Jakob had pretty much complete control over the flow of goods into and out of the duchy, and control over tariffs. Now he could trade with anyone in Europe. The Dutch, Venice, Sweden, France, you name it. Jakob's neutral foreign policy also made it so that these trade deals were extra stable and attractive. To help you understand Jakob's accumulated wealth, Jakob sent 62 warships to help Charles I of England in his civil war. Charles eventually lost, and Jakob never ended up collecting the 74,584 pounds sterling owed. Adjusted for inflation, that's quite a lot. Despite this loss, the duchy's economic growth didn't slow, and Jakob Kettler got along fine with Cromwell, the new leader of England. But with all this economic growth, where's there to go? Well, there's one, activity? I think the word is policy. There's one policy that mercantilism encourages. That's colonialism. That's right. With Jakob's fleet, he planned to sail across the ocean and settle a different continent. Jakob especially wanted something in the New World. There was one island in particular that seemed like a good place for a settlement. The island of Tobago. The Dutch tried to set up something on the island, but Native Americans and the Spanish had successfully squashed that endeavor. The first time Jakob tried getting involved in the Caribbean was all the way back in 1642, almost immediately after becoming the Duke. He financed an attempted settlement on Tobago from some Dutch dudes. The point of the settlement was to get some trade going with the Arawaks. The settlers actually made it to the island, but got attacked by some natives from St. Vincent who were at war with the Arawaks. Their fate is foggy. Jakob paid more attention to domestic issues until 1651. Instead of America, though, Jakob went to Africa, specifically the Gambia. Jakob was allowed by multiple native tribes to settle on two places on the mainland and on an island. The island was called St. Andrew's Island, though now it's known as Kunta Kinte. These settlements were supposed to allow Jakob to dominate the trade in the Gambia River, trade that was very lucrative at the time. Jakob was relatively friendly to native tribes, so despite the harsh conditions and harassment from other European powers who didn't appreciate this lowly duke getting in their way, the colony was fairly successful. In 1653, a man named Otto Steele was put in charge of the island. Despite the costs of maintaining such a settlement, this probably helped the duchy's rise in economic power, since Jakob tapped into resources that were usually limited to the Western European monarchies. But there was still potential for more economic growth and colonial success. If he had a colony in the New World, he could have his own transatlantic trade network that would net Jakob much more profit. Tobago was still unclaimed. Well, technically it belonged to the Earl of Warwick, but he wasn't doing anything with the claim. In November 1653, the massive warship known as Das Wapen der Herzogen von Courland, which translates to the coat of arms of the Duchess of Courland, headed towards Tobago. By the way, quick tangent, in 1645 Jakob Kettler married Louise Charlotte of Brandenburg, so that's the Duchess the ship's name is referring to. The ship finished its fairly uneventful journey in May of 1654. Mullins named the island New Courland, and over the coming months, the settlers would struggle hard. Unlike the settlements in the Gambia, the locals were a lot less friendly. Not all of them were absolutely hostile, but some were. Also, the tropical weather was unbearable to many, and disease was very common. Despite the struggles, the settlement survived. A fort called Fort Jakob was created, and around that a village, as well as multiple plantations in modern-day Plymouth. These plantations produced many things like ginger, indigo, and sugar. New World plantations are infamous for, to put it lightly, a very immoral practice. That practice being chattel slavery. In this series I try to portray the Duchy of Courland and Semigallia in a generally good light. This is mostly to make it easier to engage with the videos, and who doesn't like a good underdog story? But history is filled with disgusting things, and I don't want to hide that. Despite my thoughts on slavery, this system proved effective. Once again, just like in the Gambia, despite the costs of maintaining New Courland, the resources it provided increased the amount of wealth Jakob could amount, and increased the duchy's standing in Europe. But the duchy's limitations started to show themselves. In 1654, a group of Dutch settlers wanted to settle on Tobago as well. This venture was also successful, but they made it to a different side of the island. It didn't take long for them to discover each other, but neither side felt the need to kick the other one out, so they both split the island between them. The problem, well, for Jakob at least, was that the Dutch side was better in a few ways. It wasn't near the traditional canoe routes that the natives took, so they were attacked much less than the Colonial side. This also meant that it was a safer place for European ships to stop if ever they wanted to land on the island. So even if they wished to make their way to Fort Jakob, for example, they would probably dock at Lampsons, which was the name of the village at that point. Although all of this was disadvantageous for Jakob, he wasn't deterred, and his colony was still profitable despite the competition. In fact, Jakob was ready for more. He went to Pope Innocent X and proposed a plan. He was going to send 40 ships with 24,000 people to Australia, which was discovered fairly recently. He wanted the Pope's funding in exchange for allowing Catholic missionaries to hop on and convert all the Aboriginals. The duchy was supposed to be a Lutheran state, but Jakob isn't the type to let religion get in the way of profit. It didn't matter anyway, because in 1655 Innocent died, and his successor was less keen on the idea. Despite having to throw out this idea, the duchy's economic rise didn't stop. It seemed like nothing could stop Jakob. But there's a reason that you're not taught about the Colonial Empire. As Jakob was becoming very successful, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was kind of falling apart. It lost a lot of its land to a Cossack rebellion in Ukraine, a Russian invasion, and starting in 1655, to the Swedish. This whole thing is part of a series of events known as the Deluge, which is very interesting if not convoluted. The only thing we need to know is that Jakob's neutral foreign policy didn't save Jakob this time. Jakob didn't invest much into the duchy's military, so its military power was practically non-existent. Jakob tried to pay Sweden huge sums of money, and he allied with the Duke of Brandenburg Prussia, whose sister was Jakob's wife. Prussia ended up allying itself with Sweden. Karl X, the Swedish king, didn't see any reason to leave Courland and Semigallia alone, so his army went to Jelgava and captured Jakob. The army didn't face any resistance. Jakob lived in custody in Riga for a bit, and then in Ivangorod. While Jakob was gone, the duchy dealt with the almost complete collapse. The production of goods was almost completely halted. The duchy couldn't contact its colonies. It was ravaged by Swedish, Lithuanian, and even Prussian troops. Just in case it wasn't bad enough, a terrible epidemic killed roughly 1/3 of the duchy's population. 1/3. It's hard to wrap your head around. In 1660, the war was over and Jakob was returned to the duchy. He was a rising star in Europe. He had an insane trade network, colonies, connections. Now he was left with a duchy that was a husk of its former self. He even had to cede some territory to Sweden. He would spend the rest of his reign rebuilding the economy. And his colonies, well, they were both taken from Jakob. The situation with the colonies is more interesting than Jakob's domestic policies, so from now I'll focus on that. Let's start with the Gambia. In 1659, the Dutch West India Company pressured Henry Momber, who's described as an agent or commissioner of the Duke in Amsterdam, to accept a contract that gave all of Jakob's colonies in Africa to the company until Jakob could resume ownership. This would allow the settlements to be maintained while Jakob was imprisoned. Momber did send a message to Otto, the guy who was in charge of the Gambia settlements, that if he could resist the Dutch, then he should. He couldn't, so the settlements were given over to the company. The Dutch only got the colony for a few months before a French pirate, probably working for the Kingdom of Sweden, attacked St. Andrew's Island and absolutely destroyed it. After that happened, the Amsterdam Chamber, the chamber of the Dutch West India Company that was in charge of these settlements, gave it to a different chamber, the Groningen Chamber. This chamber wasn't keen on keeping it either, so they told Momber that he could have the colony back. Momber was very happy to hear that, since Jakob was released around a month before that, and Momber didn't want to piss off Jakob by telling him that he gave away the African colony. So a contract was signed in 1660, Otto Steele was in charge again, but there was trouble already. Apparently the Amsterdam Chamber didn't want Groningen to just give away the colony, so a couple of their ships went to St. Andrew's Island. They took the island and took some Courlanders, including Otto, hostage. Some native tribes interfered, whatever that means, and successfully got the Dutch to leave again. So after that, even after Jakob got restored to his position, Jakob still held on to the Gambia. Well, kinda. They pretty much only held on to St. Andrew's Island from that point. The Dutch weren't the ones to ultimately take this colony. That was the English. In 1661, the newly instated Charles II of England chartered the Company of Royal Adventurers of England trading with Africa. First thing they did was harass the Dutch in Cape Verde. After taking an island, they sailed down to St. Andrew's Island. Otto couldn't tell whether the frigate was friendly or there to attack like the previous Dutch ships did. And as they say, when in doubt, shoot it down. So he fired upon the frigate. Then the captain threatened to level the fort on the island. Otto promptly gave the island up. The British held on to the island until a fire broke out and most of the stuff, including the munitions, were made useless. So then the island was abandoned by the British too. But this time, Otto didn't return. The duchy would never again hold the colony in Africa. But how about America? Well, after the Dutch side of the island heard of Jakob's capture, they pretty quickly thought up schemes to take over the entire island. One of the things they did was promote the idea that Jakob abandoned his American colony. You see, the Tobago colony was already in a pretty bad shape. Most of the original settlers were dead, even the priests dipped after a while, and now that the colony was no longer getting support or information, it didn't take much interference before the settlers gave up their fort in exchange for a trip back to Europe in 1659. The Dutch manned Fort Jakob for a while, but they mostly stayed on their original side since it was so much better. But just like in the Gambia, that wasn't the end of Jakob's involvement with the island. In 1664, Charles II signed a deal with Jakob. Charles would recognize Jakob's claim to Tobago in exchange for him giving up his claim to his colonies in the Gambia. The island would trade European hands like a game of hot potato for the next few years. In 1668, Jakob finally sent another group of settlers, but there was a mutiny on board and the ship was forced back. In 1680, when Jakob was around 69 years old, he sent a successful voyage led by an English lieutenant. Fort Jakob was left in ruins, and in less than a year the lieutenant gave up and just went to Barbados. Thankfully, a year later, Colonel Monk led a second wave of colonizers that got to the island in 1681. Monk actually set up a permanent settlement on the island, though Monk defied Jakob's orders and attacked the locals, which made living much harder. But the settlement somehow kept going. Jakob's colonial ambition was at least somewhat restored, although this would not be a very long-lived colony. At least Jakob wouldn't live to see it fail, because on December 31st, 1681, after less than 40 years of being Duke, Jakob Kettler passed away. Jakob Kettler was an intelligent and ambitious man who took what he had and created something special. An economic boom and colonial network that, although short-lived and costly when it came to the lives of many settlers and African slaves, made him one of the most well-known people in Europe during his day. But exactly what made his rise to power so interesting and impressive were the limitations that his dukedom had, and those limitations were what led to his downfall. I say downfall, but even after the collapse of his colonies and the collapse of his economy, he was still able to bring the duchy back from a war and epidemic that devastated it. And his colonial ambition was still in him when he became 70, which allowed him to die with the knowledge that despite what happened in his late 40s, he didn't lose everything. There is a quote which is attributed to the King of Sweden, Karl X. I couldn't confirm whether this actually came from him, but I'm still gonna share it because it's quite apt. The quote goes, "Jakob was too rich and powerful to be a duke, but he was too small and poor to become a king." Which sounds about right.